When the HOA pushed forward with its grand development plan, they believed they were making history. A gleaming new neighborhood of 156 luxury homes rose up on land they thought they had rightfully acquired, complete with manicured lawns, private parks, and a clubhouse that symbolized their influence. Families flocked in, mortgages were signed, and property values soared. To the board, it looked like a perfect success story. But what they didn't know was that the land they were so eager to claim had been in one family's possession for more than a century. The man who quietly owned it, the last descendant of a long line of black farmers, never sold it, never ceded it, and never released the ironclad deed his great-grandfather secured 100 years earlier. It wasn't just ownership, it was a trap carefully designed to protect the family's legacy against anyone who might try to take it away. The HOA didn't realize their contracts, titles, and developments all sat on ground they had no legal right to build on. And by the time they uncovered the truth, the trap had already sprung, leaving 156 homes, countless homeowners, and the entire HOA empire standing on land that didn't belong to them. The land stretched for miles, wide open fields that had once been the pride of a farming family. Generations of sweat had soaked into its soil, and every fence post, every oak tree, every stream carried the weight of history. But by the time the Homeowners Association came into the picture, all they saw was potential profit. The board members didn't see the land as sacred or historic, they saw it as a blank canvas for their vision of a pristine, upscale neighborhood. The president of the HOA, a woman named Margaret Whitfield, stood at the edge of the property one sunny afternoon, smiling with the confidence of someone who thought the future was already in her grasp. "We'll build here," she told the developers, her perfectly manicured hand gesturing over the rolling acres. 156 homes. A clubhouse. Maybe even a pool. Families will pay anything to be part of a community like this. Developers nodded, contractors took notes, and investors wrote checks. Soon, bulldozers crawled across the land, leveling fields and clearing trees. The sound of hammers and saws replaced the birdsong, and houses began to rise from the dirt, row by row, until the skeleton of an entire neighborhood stood where crops once grew. To the HOA, this was triumph, a monument to their leadership, proof that they could transform wilderness into wealth. But there was a problem, one no one on the board bothered to consider. For all their contracts and permits, for all their glossy brochures and ribbon-cutting ceremonies, no one had ever actually traced the land deed back to its origin. No one asked who really owned it. They believed the paperwork provided by a middleman developer who claimed to have secured everything legitimately. They never considered the possibility that someone, somewhere, was watching. And someone was. Isaiah Carter wasn't a man who liked to be noticed. In his early 40s, he lived quietly in a modest farmhouse on the edge of town, a place that had been in his family for generations. He worked part-time as a history professor at the local college, but his true passion was preserving the stories of his ancestors, their struggles, their victories, and most importantly, their land. That land, stretching over hundreds of acres, had been bought and secured by his great-grandfather, a man who had survived Reconstruction and vowed that no one would ever take his family's soil away again. Isaiah knew the history of every inch of it. He could point out where his great-grandfather had planted his first crops, where his grandfather had built the barn, and where his own father had taught him to fish in the creek. But he also knew something else, something no one outside the family ever seemed to understand. When his great-grandfather signed the original deed, he'd done it with a sharp lawyer by his side, a man who understood how fragile black land ownership could be in a hostile world. They drew up a contract so airtight, so protected, that it contained a clause few modern developers would ever bother to read. That clause ensured that the land could never be transferred, leased, or sold without explicit approval from a Carter descendant. Any contract that claimed otherwise would be null and void. And to make matters worse for the HOA, every structure built on the land without permission would legally belong not to the builders or the buyers, but to the rightful landowner himself. It was, in every sense of the word, a trap. Isaiah had watched quietly as the bulldozers arrived, shaking his head as fences were torn down and surveyors marked off lots. He didn't interfere. He didn't call the police or storm into a board meeting. Instead, he waited. He collected photos, videos, and documents. He checked courthouse filings, watched title transfers, and made copies of every recorded deed that conspicuously left his family's name off the paperwork. And with every house that went up, with every new driveway poured, the trap grew tighter. By the time the 156th home was finished, the HOA was celebrating with champagne and speeches. Margaret Whitfield cut the ribbon on the brand new clubhouse, smiling for the cameras as she declared the development a shining example of what vision and leadership can achieve. Homeowners clapped, children played in the manicured park, and the community seemed to believe it was safe, secure, and prosperous. But Isaiah knew better. He knew it was only a matter of time before the truth came crashing down. Late one evening, after the celebration had ended and the streets grew quiet, Isaiah sat at his kitchen table with a thick folder of documents in front of him. His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory, words he'd heard countless times as a boy. "This land is more than dirt, Isaiah. It's our proof that we survived. Never let them take it." He traced the edge of the century-old deed with his finger, the ink faded but still legible. The clause was still there, as ironclad as the day it was written. The HOA might have thought they were clever, might have thought they could build their empire unchecked, but they had walked straight into his family's defense, a defense planted 100 years earlier and waiting patiently for this very moment. Isaiah leaned back in his chair, staring out the window at the dark silhouette of the new neighborhood. Lights twinkled in the distance from the houses, the lives of hundreds of families unfolding on land they didn't truly own. He didn't hate them. He didn't want to see children uprooted or families ruined. But he also knew that justice wasn't always clean. The HOA had gambled with land they didn't bother to understand, and now the price would be paid. The trap was set. All that remained was to spring it. The first crack in the HOA's illusion came quietly, like a hairline fracture in glass that no one notices until it spreads. It started with a letter. One morning, a homeowner named David Langston walked out to his mailbox, coffee in hand, expecting the usual: bills, advertisements, maybe a flyer for the neighborhood's upcoming barbecue. Instead, tucked neatly among the envelopes was an official-looking document. Heavy paper, a seal, his name in bold type across the top. At first, he thought it was some mistake. But as he read, his stomach sank. The letter informed him that his house, his brand new, freshly painted home he'd just moved into 6 months earlier, was built on property still legally owned by the Carter family. The deed he thought he'd signed was invalid. The mortgage papers were worthless. And the clause at the bottom was even more devastating. According to the law, the structure now legally belonged to the Carters. He and his family were tenants, not owners. David laughed nervously, shoving the letter at his wife as if the absurdity would somehow erase it. But she didn't laugh. She read it twice, her hands trembling. By that evening, 3 other families on their street had received the same letter. By the end of the week, dozens of homes were buzzing with confusion and panic. The HOA scrambled to contain the chaos. Margaret Whitfield called an emergency board meeting, her usual cool confidence replaced with sharp frustration. The board gathered in the clubhouse, the same building where they'd toasted their success only weeks before. Now the air was thick with tension. "This is a scam," Margaret declared, slamming a letter onto the table. "Some con artist is trying to scare our residents into thinking their homes aren't theirs. We'll get our lawyers on it immediately." But one of the board members, an older man named Harold, cleared his throat uneasily. "I had our title company review this," he admitted. "And it's not a scam. The Carters' deed is real. It's been filed and recorded for over 100 years. There's even a protective clause that overrides every single transaction we've done. The homeowners don't technically own their homes. Legally speaking," he hesitated, glancing at the room. "Legally speaking, the Carters do." The room erupted into chaos. Voices overlapped, people shouting about lawsuits, property values, and reputations. Margaret sat stiff in her chair, her face pale but her eyes cold with determination. "No," she said firmly, her voice cutting through the noise. "I don't care what some century-old document says. We've built a community here. We've sold homes. Families have invested their lives. This Carter man isn't going to just waltz in and take everything. We'll fight it." But outside the clubhouse, fear spread like wildfire. Homeowners whispered over fences, compared letters, and called their banks in panic. Mortgages were suddenly worthless, titles invalid. Some families threatened to sue the HOA for fraud, demanding answers. Others packed boxes quietly, afraid of being thrown out of homes they thought they owned. Meanwhile, Isaiah Carter remained silent. He didn't rush to the neighborhood or demand evictions. He let the documents do their work, let the weight of the truth sink in on its own. He'd expected resistance, of course. No one gave up millions of dollars in property without a fight. But he also knew that the law was on his side. And if the HOA pushed, they would only dig themselves deeper. Within days, local newspapers picked up the story. Headlines blared. New development built on disputed land, and families fear homes could belong to someone else. Reporters hounded Margaret outside her office, cameras flashing as she snapped, "We are handling the situation internally." But behind closed doors, she was panicking. Calls poured in from furious residents. Lawsuits loomed, and the Carter name was on everyone's lips. One night, Margaret drove out to the farmhouse where Isaiah lived. She didn't announce her visit. She just showed up, her luxury SUV crunching over the gravel driveway. Isaiah was sitting on his porch when she arrived, a book in his hands. He didn't look surprised to see her. "Mr. Carter," she began briskly, climbing the steps in heels that sank into the wood. "We need to talk." Isaiah set the book aside, his calm eyes fixed on her. "I imagine we do." She didn't waste time on pleasantries. "This thing you're doing, sending letters, stirring up panic, you're destroying families. You have no idea how much damage you're causing." Isaiah tilted his head. "I'm not causing anything. I didn't build houses on land that wasn't mine. Your HOA did that. I'm just reminding people of the truth." Margaret bristled. "We can make this right. The HOA is prepared to offer you compensation. A generous sum, in fact. We'll pay you for the land retroactively. Everyone wins." Isaiah shook his head slowly. "Everyone except my family. Do you know how many times land was stolen from black families over the last 100 years? Do you know how many deeds were ignored, how many homes were bulldozed, how many legacies erased? My great-grandfather knew this day would come. He made sure we'd never have to beg for what was already ours." Her face hardened. "So what do you want? To evict 156 families? To burn everything down? Because that's what this will lead to." Isaiah leaned forward slightly, his voice steady. "What I want is respect for what's mine. My family's name on what we built. And accountability from people like you who thought the rules didn't apply. This isn't just land, it's history. And if that means your HOA has to pay the price, so be it." For a long moment, they stared at each other, two worlds colliding, one built on entitlement, the other on survival. Margaret realized then that Isaiah wasn't bluffing. He wasn't looking for a quick payday or a settlement he could be talked out of. He was prepared to fight for as long as it took. When she finally left, her hands clenched around the steering wheel, Margaret knew the HOA was in deeper trouble than she'd ever imagined. Back in the neighborhood, word spread that the Carter family wasn't interested in selling out. Panic escalated. Some homeowners organized meetings, demanding answers. Others contacted lawyers of their own. The board was besieged by angry calls day and night. And through it all, Isaiah waited patiently, the 100-year trap working exactly as his great-grandfather intended. The HOA had built its empire on his land. And now, brick by brick, that empire was starting to crumble.